Hi, this is Alan Gleeson for ADSR. Please subscribe to the ADSR YouTube channel for further tutorials. In this video, we will look at various ways we can set up routing to effects using inserts or auxiliary sends and returns, and when using auxiliary sends, why we use pre and post fader settings. So a brief overview first. What I will discuss in this video is the setup you will find in a hardware or software configuration. Hardware mixers tend to be somewhat fixed, where software mixers allow more flexibility and may vary slightly from DAW to DAW, but the general principles and operation are the same. I'll start off by discussing insert effects. So I'll solo this first track here, which is a kick drum, and I'll go to my effects section and grab an effect. So a classic example of an insert effect is an EQ. When we're using an EQ, we want to process 100% of the signal, and that's what inserts allow us to do. So I might want to EQ it. All the effects that you have available in your DAW can be used as insert effects. And if you've ever used a guitar pedal, it's a similar configuration setting with inserts. The signal from our channel is routed through the effect, it gets processed within the effect, and then the output is sent on the master bus, which we hear through our stereo fader. Other types of effects that we might use as inserts have a dry-wet control, and this allows us to control the balance between the dry signal and the wet signal. The dry-wet control is also useful when we're combining different effects together in a chain, where we don't want to process all of the signal that's been fed into the next device. So another one, I might grab a reverb, and my dry-wet controls allow me to set how much of the dry signal has been passed on to the next effect for processing in the chain. So using inserts is pretty self-explanatory. You have your signal coming into the channel and it's processed through whatever insert effects you've placed on that, or if the device doesn't have a dry-wet control, it will process 100% of the material. The other routing configuration we have when we're setting up our effects in our mix is auxiliary sends, or aux sends for short. Whether it's a hardware or software configuration, you will have a section on a channel that deals with the sends, and we have our return section over here, which is where the signal gets routed to. When I turn up a send, typically by default they're set up as post fader sends, which means that the signal is sent after the fader. So if I solo this track here and I turn up my first send here, which is a post fade send, it's producing a copy of the signal that's coming into this channel and sending it over to this return channel here, which has a reverb on it. If I adjust the fader position, it is linked to the send control. So when I reduce this value here, the amount of signal that's been sent from our send will also be reduced, which will have the effect of reducing the signal that's going into my return track with the reverb on it. So typical uses for post fader sends is when you want to send a number of signals to the same effect. The classic use of this is when you're sending a number of instruments to reverb or delay with your classic return effects. I've got a drum kit here. If I want to make the sound between these different drum sounds consistent, I can place them in a room by sending a small amount of each of the signals to the reverb unit. So without the return track. Another use of a post fader send is when we want to build excitement or a crescendo to a particular sound. The sound might build to a crescendo and then die off, and we want a tail of an effect to continue on afterwards. So on my other track over here, we have a bass playing. You hear the effect coming in. Reach the peak, then I mute the channel. The other type of aux send we have is a pre-fader send. Now, depending on the DAW you're using, you will have control to set whether the send is pre or post fade either on the channel, or in the case of Ableton, we just have a global setting on our master channel to set whether a particular send is pre or post. So if I repeat the example in the beginning, on our kick drum, been sent to the reverb, and this time I'll set it up as a pre-fade send. So when the fader is at 0, the result will be the same whether it's post or pre. The difference comes in pre when I start to reduce the volume on the channel. Because it's a pre-fader send, a copy of the signal is being sent prior to the fader. So when I reduce the fader position, It will reduce the volume on that channel going to the master bus, but the signal is still being sent to our return channel. And all we're hearing now is 100% of the reverb. When you're using a pre-fader send, when you want to control the balance between the dry and the unprocessed signal, you reduce the level on the track. On a post-fader send, when you want to reduce the relationship between the dry and the processed signal, you control it with the auxiliary send. So you can use that as a creative effect on my bass track here. If I route it to another return track over here, which has a number of effects on it, that's a post fader send at the minute. If I switch it over to pre, and this can allow me now to reduce the volume or remove it totally. Now we're left with just the return channel. And we can bring in back in the bass. Another use for pre-fader sends might be when you want to submix or group the output of a number of channels together. So if I turn down all auxiliary sends on these first 3 tracks, which are my drum tracks, and I route them to this return channel over here, subgroup. So on the 4th one, I'll just turn it up all the way. So when it's turned up all the way, it means whatever the signal has been sent to here, this level here, is the exact same level as been routed into this channel here. So if I sent them as a pre-fader send, I could now take down the volume on the channels and switch this auxiliary send to be pre. And now when I play, I get a subgroup of these 3 channels being mixed to a single return track over here. And then on that track, I can apply some processing. So if I wanted to maybe do some multi-band compression or add distortion or whatever kind of effect you might want to apply. So this brings up the case again. If you want to use similar processing on a number of channels, you can do so in the return section, saving CPU for use in other areas in your mix, such as virtual instruments and more inserts on individual channels. So there's typical effects that you'll use on return channels set up using auxiliary sends. Things like reverbs, delays, and complicated multi-effects chains where you might want to route multiple signals to them. Another less typical example is using dynamics effects on return channels. Typically you'll use dynamic effects as inserts, but there's some mixing techniques that require it to be set up in parallel. So on my subgroup here, because we've already got our multiband dynamics here, is we can set up parallel compression. So if I make some settings in this device here, so currently they're being sent to this return track as a pre-fader send. So what I can do now is if I bring up these channels, we're here bringing the dry signal back in. What we're getting now is parallel compression, a classic technique in mixing. We have a dry signal over here and a processed signal over here. The only area of concern when you're doing this type of processing is introducing phase issues. If you're using plugins that introduce latency to the signal path, you can get phase offsets, so it's something to keep in mind. Another more creative use of using dynamics in a return setup is that in this setup here, you have a dry signal over here being fed into a return track that's heavily compressed. Now I've got 2 options. I can either send the dynamic uncompressed signal into a reverb, or if I wanted to, I could also send my heavily compressed signal into the reverb. So if I send using a post fader from these tracks, and I adjust my reverb settings, so I pick something there that's quite a creative kind of reverb sound. So if you've got a lot of dynamics that maybe in my drum here, they have been preserved, been sent into my reverb channel. So I have more dynamic in the return that's coming back. If I wanted a more flat response, what I could do is on my heavily compressed channel over here, going to enable all the sends. I can now route that signal into my reverb channel. So it's a more controlled signal that's been routed into the reverb. So we looked at various routing options and setups there for why you want to use inserts and why you want to use auxiliary sends pre and post fader. But as most things in sound engineering and mixing, there are no rules, only guidelines to help you understand the routing within your system. Auxiliary sends in particular allow the setup of very complicated processing chains within your mix that you can send various signals into, and you can also route your various return channels into each other again to create more evolving and complicated textures. This has been Alan Gleeson for ADSR. Please subscribe to the ADSR YouTube channel for further tutorials.